On behalf of the January 22nd Peace and Social Justice Show, I just want to welcome into the studio two wonderful, wonderful young ladies that I've gotten to know. Some I've known Linda, a lot from going to the Chico Peace Vigil on Saturdays, and I kind of told Linda I try to get my Linda Furr fix going down to the Chico Peace Vigil. So maybe you two ladies can introduce yourself and for the Palestine Action Group here in Chico.
This is Ann Polivka, and I've been involved with the Chico Peace and Justice Center for a few years, being on the board, and I'm also the liaison between the board and our staff director. So thank you so much, Bill, for having us here.
I'm Linda Furr, and I have been sort of the coordinator of the Peace Vigil that takes place every Saturday, 12:30 to 1:30, at the corner of 3rd and Main. I've been the coordinator there for about 13 years.
So welcome to the studio. I'm really happy to have you guys in here. So we were kind of talking, getting this interview together about, when we had our first memories of this Palestine-Israeli conflict. And I can say what mine was, and I lived in a home where it really wasn't political along those lines. So my family had no, ideas or any inputs on this whole Palestine that I remember, this whole Palestine-Israeli. But I remember the rock fights as a young kid, probably 10, 11, 12. And that was something we kind of did as a plaything in our neighborhood. So I can remember distinctly seeing that protest of kids throwing rocks. And it kind of drew me to that conflict. And I don't know if I chose sides or not, but I was kind of like, I'm with the rock throwing kids. Of course I am. I'm throwing rocks in my own neighborhood, So that was kind of my first foray, so to speak, is seeing this on the TV, is rock fights. What would you two ladies have to say about, your memories and how you grew up with this conflict in your home?
Well, I was pretty much grown up by the time I became aware of it was called the beginnings of the Intifada at that time, or that word was placed on it soon. I saw it on television, young boys throwing rocks at very well-armed, very efficient-looking soldiers, military people. That's my first memory. These were kids, and I understood that to mean this was the age of the kids. This age of kids were the first kids born under the occupation. They were 15 years old. They were throwing rocks at the occupying Israeli soldiers. This was in Gaza.
And myself, and I want to say, please pardon my voice because I have laryngitis. This is Ann speaking, and my first memories of the conflict actually weren't so detailed. I lived in Israel when I was a little girl. My father worked with the United Nations at Lud Airport, which is now Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. We lived in Tel Aviv. And as a 5-year-old, which is when I moved there in 1952, just 4 years after the State of Israel came into being. As a 5-year-old, I wasn't really sophisticated about anything, but I did notice the tensions when we crossed what was called no man's land at that time on our way from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or over to the Dead Sea and the River Jordan. So I was aware of those kinds of tensions. My father had fought the Nazis as a Czechoslovakian who left his country because the Nazis had come in. So I was very sensitized at an early age about what that kind of oppression means to a person and how it can force somebody out of their own country and make them always long for their own country and for peace there. So I was sympathetic to Jewish people. I'd read the diary of Anne Frank. I helped in Chico about 10 or 15 years ago set up the Anne Frank exhibit with others here in Chico to sensitize people to the problems of anti-Semitism. I feel I was quite sensitive. But then in, about 2008 or so, there was a speaker, Colonel Ann Wright, who spoke at one of the Chico Peace and Justice Center annual dinners. And she was an American military official who resigned from the force. She was in Iraq. And she spoke about what had been happening in Gaza during the Cast-led occupation and invasion back in about 07, 08. And I decided I wanted to go on the Gaza Freedom March, which was taking place the following year, right at Christmas. About 1,400 of us from across the world went to first Cairo in Egypt with the intention of going from there by bus into Gaza and supporting the Gaza people with humanitarian aid and moral support, because just the year before they'd been really mercilessly attacked, I guess I would have to use that kind of language, by the Israeli military force in an attempt to subjugate them and to continue the occupation of their land. So we weren't able to get into Gaza. The Egyptian government made it impossible for most of us to, but a small group of about 100 did. So I was in contact with people who were from Gaza, who were Palestinians from the West Bank, and with those kinds of early contacts, I resolved to come back and make this conflict more visible, more audible, to put some spotlighting focus on it when I came back to the States. So I've been doing that ever since as part of the Palestine Action Group and the Chico Peace and Justice Center Middle East Working Group. It's been a real, it's been a big effort on my part, working with other wonderful people, including Linda.
Wow, that's a great introduction, ladies. So maybe we could kind of take it from there and expand upon the history of the action group and what it's all about, what your mission is, and that kind of stuff, what you guys are doing.
Well,
I can start, sure.
Okay, thank you.
So about, I would say maybe 5, 6 years ago or so, the Palestine Action Group was born out of an effort to really do something about our values. There'd been the Middle East Working Group, which was doing a lot of educational work in the community, having speakers, and doing educational presentations on campus and in churches all over Chico. And we loved that work, but we also wanted to focus on the work of boycott, divestment, and sanctions related to Israel's occupation in Palestine. We really felt, as part of the Palestine Action Group, and I can give the website at the end of this interview, we really felt that action was needed, as well as educational work. And part of that action was boycott, which we could do locally. Part was encouraging divestment, which we gathered signatures for, encouraging PERS, the Public Employees Retirement System, and STIRS, the Teachers Retirement System, to divest from Caterpillar and Veolia, which are two companies. Caterpillar, of course, makes huge militarized bulldozers that destroy Palestinian homes and farms and outbuildings and make it impossible for them to have a life there. So we've been a small group from the outset, just a few people, some Jewish and some not, some Palestinian and Arab and some not. A very small group, but potent, I think, and energetic. And we've called for boycott because we do feel that we are in a situation now in 2016, the way South Africa was back in, when was it, the 80s, when we asked people to boycott and divest from South Africa. In fact, there are governments across the world that put a sanction on South African trade and business. So we're asking for that. We're asking for that because it's a nonviolent way of resisting the state of Israel's policies in regards to the Palestinian people, which basically is to occupy their lands, their homes, to make it impossible for them to be independent and autonomous citizens in Israel and to get their own land back again, which is what was stolen from them in the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
The Palestine Action Group supports the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest, Sanction movement, which is international. And they are encouraging entities of all kinds, governments, businesses, universities, to cities, to boycott, to disinvest from Israel because of its internationally illegal apartheid actions. The most infuriating, I would imagine, to the Palestinian people, the most infuriating thing I think that Israel does to the Palestinians is occupy their land, number one, but build Jewish settlements on their land, right next to their villages, and they're taking up the land that has been basically promised to be Palestine. And as they build these settlements, it makes it more and more difficult for there to be a Palestine. And the international community has called for a two-state solution, that there will be a Palestine, there will be an Israel. And the International Court of Humanity, no, of Justice, the United Nations, the United States, and, believe it or not, the Israeli Supreme Court have ruled that Israel's occupation of Palestinian land in the West Bank especially, Israel has moved out of Gaza. There was just too much turmoil. They did move out. They are now occupying, they continue to occupy the West Bank and build settlements, which to me has got to be heartbreaking to Palestinians to see their land being used for settlements for Jewish, and they call them Jewish settlements. These are more the more right-wing Jewish people. These are Jewish settlements. Not all Jews feel that this is right, but in the meantime, because of the government, by the way, this right-wing Israeli government, they're being built. It's the Israeli government that does not feel that this is Palestinian land. Those international courts, plus the United Nations and even the Supreme Court of Israel, say this is Palestinian land.
Maybe I'll make a comment, actually, because from the level of knowledge I have about the boycotts, is what's kind of fascinating about the boycotts and why they've been successful. And they're being successful. Some countries are actually looking at passing laws to make doing boycotts illegal. But Israel, by definition, is a fairly small country and has a fairly small amount of economic activity. So when you get these large multinational conglomerates whose really their only guise is to make more and more and more money, if they kind of look at their bottom line saying, I'm doing 0.05% with Israel and it's costing me 10% of my business with the rest of the world, they're very willing to cut ties in politically correct ways to do that. I mean, is there anything you could expand on that? Or?
Well, there are corporations that are heavily invested in Israel, and we are asking for a boycott of those. And for instance, for PERS, the Public Employees Retirement System, to divest from Veolia, from Caterpillar, and from other kinds of corporations, basically. Hewlett-Packard is another one. It's very common. We probably have a Hewlett-Packard right here in this building.
I'm retired Hewlett-Packard. Boom.
Okay, so there you go.
There you go.
Hewlett-Packard
big part.
is big in terms of communications systems, and so they're very involved with the checkpoints in Israel, the military checkpoints that Palestinians, the Arabs, have to go through that no Jewish person has to go through. For instance, they enforce the apartheid that's going on in Israel right now. But there have been victories. And I'd first heard of the BDS movement when I was in Egypt on the Gaza Freedom March. And what it was, how I heard of it, is it was a request on the part of Palestinian civil society that the international community, because they need international help, they're trying to carry on, there's a lot of Palestinians that are trying to carry on a nonviolent movement for social change. So they were requesting us internationals to go back all over the world where we came from and encourage and educate about nonviolent resistance in the form of doing boycotts and divestments. So that's what we've been doing. And I was really tickled to learn recently, just over the last month, that San Jose State University right here in California is the first state university in our state to say that their campus and the college community as a whole needs to divest from any companies that profit from the Israeli occupation. Yeah. Also, the University of California campuses have approved divestment from a company called G4S because it's of its involvement in private prisons in Israel. And those prisons are used to torture kids even. I know a Palestinian man who was an instructor on campus at Chico State in the nursing department, Mohammed Asia is his name, who said at the age of 12, because he was part of a group that was considering, according to the Israeli authorities, considering doing some rock throwing against his Israeli tanks, he was forced into prison for 6 months at the age of 12. They hadn't even done anything, but they were considering, supposedly, according to the authorities, and placed into impossible positions, 1 foot up in the air. It's torture of kids. It's child torture. So the fact that University of California campuses have approved divestment from G4S is a real victory. There are gradually, slowly, victories being won by the BDS movement. It's very slow, but it's scary to those who support the racist, Zionist attitudes of the State of Israel. And mark my words, this is not an anti-Jewish campaign. It's not an anti-Judaism religion campaign. It's a campaign for human rights.
Campaign nonviolence, too. Yeah.
Nonviolence.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very nonviolent, and it's about
Injustice.
it's one of the injustice. Yeah, it's one of the
Yep.
few nonviolent options that are open to those who would resist this kind of oppression on the part of the State of Israel. And we're not trying to say the State of Israel is the only country in the world that is oppressive. There are plenty of countries, but our focus has been working in this way, partly because, some of us are Jewish and we're sensitized to the issue, and we don't want our people doing this kind of thing, causing the kind of suffering that was caused to us.
What is the kind of feeling in the occupied areas, fellow Jewish people towards fellow Palestinians that are physically living there in that environment?
Right now on the West Bank, they are in a state of fear, the settlers and the Palestinians, because there's another uprising. I don't know if they've termed it an intifada or not, but there is an uprising now. And since October, and we've got the Palestinians throwing the rocks, and we've got the Israeli soldiers with the bullets, the guns and the bullets. But there have been just less than 300 people who have been killed since October.
October last year?
This year, yeah, 2015.
Yeah. Wow.
And we are now January what? Yeah. Well, that's a small number compared to how many people were killed in Gaza in the summer of 2014. Over 1,000, 1,500 in a 30-day period or a 40-day period. Well, right now it's going on in the West Bank. You see, Gaza is walled off. So it's much easier to drop bombs and things on Gaza, Israel. And this is United States financially supported military. Mm-hmm. It's much easier for Israel to cause a lot of damage in a much shorter time in Gaza because they're walled off, and they're practically all civilians. In the West Bank, 28 of the people of just less than 300 people, 28 have been Israeli. The rest have been Palestinian, including women and children. And the Palestinians have children throwing rocks, although they have been stabbing people lately, and they're immediately killed because the military, those that do that, are immediately killed because the soldiers are right nearby, everywhere in the West Bank. That's the west part of west side of the Jordan River when we talk about the West Bank.
So it would seem this, when we have these conflicts, you've got Israelis living amongst the Palestinians on the West Bank.
In the West Bank,
So if we start firing rockets, it's going to affect anyone that's living on the West Bank. So it's going to affect the Israeli settlers and the Palestinians. What's kind of the feeling on the ground there of that community? I would think they'd have some sense of community.
Terrible fear.
They have fear. We got the
Yes.
fear part, but I mean, do they have a sense of camaraderie? How is the interrelationships between the Jewish settlers and the Palestine?
Terrible.
Terrible.
The settlers
Yeah.
with the Palestinians, it's terrible.
They're not in the same coffee shops drinking coffee. It's all segregated.
Absolutely not. Now
This is
they
like-
are
okay.
in the rest of Israel. There throughout Israel, the Palestinian people and the Arab people and Jewish people get along much better. But in the West Bank, there is a marketplace, an ancient marketplace, a Palestinian marketplace, like our farmers' market, only much more extensive, ancient. Right next to it, the settlers have built a settlement. Israel has built a settlement for Jews, have a Jewish settlement right next to that, and that's those people in that apartment. These are high-rise apartments, lovely new modern edifices. That apartment, people throw down garbage and sewage, etc., down onto that marketplace. Do you know the name of it?
Hebron is the town.
And the Palestinians have put a net up above the marketplace to catch the garbage that is thrown down there on a regular basis. They are treated terribly. The Palestinians are treated terribly in the West Bank. They must go through checkpoints practically every place they go.
I haven't
Okay,
been
thanks.
over there, and I've heard what Linda's talking about. And I would say that both in the West Bank and in Israel proper, that there's tensions and fears. Nobody knows who to trust. But it wasn't always like this. If you go back to maybe 100 years ago or so, when Jewish people were first coming over, or maybe even to the end of the 19th century, when Jewish people, because of centuries of oppression and marginalization and the pogroms, all that kind of persecution that was happening for Jews over the centuries in Europe, without support from the Catholic Church or other of the main churches or groups in that area. And so there was individual Jewish families, and as groups they started coming gradually, increasing in numbers, starting maybe at the end of the 19th century, to the land of Palestine. It wasn't called Israel at that time. It was inhabited by nomadic sheep herding and sometimes a little bit of farming going on. It was Palestine. And so at that point, there wasn't that much resistance and friction on the part of the Palestinian local indigenous population. But it gradually started increasing in the last century as there were more and more and more Jewish people coming, and some of them started taking over lands that previously had been grazing lands for the Arab sheep herders, camel herders, and they started putting their towns up, and they eventually came in with military and eventually started subduing. But at the beginning, things were a little bit more easygoing. Actually, some Jewish people had lived in Palestine, over the centuries.
Oh, yes.
Over the centuries, back to, back and back and back for centuries. They didn't all leave that area in, the early part of the, after Christ, in the first and second centuries. There have always been some Jewish people that were there, and they generally got along fine with the Palestinian neighbors. It was when there was a really powerful Zionist movement that especially got on a head of steam in the 30s and 40s, and especially with the establishment of the State of Israel in 48, that huge numbers of Jewish people started coming, and they came with the idea that this was going to be a homeland for the Jews, not keeping in mind the fact that there were already people living there. There were Arabs, Palestinians with their own culture, their own ways of doing things, their own religion, their own lifestyles, and their own lands and homes. But the friction started coming and getting more intense when the Palestinian Arabs realized that the Jewish people that were coming in terms of their leadership, really wanted to kick them out, really wanted to push them out the way that actually Native Americans were pushed out. The indigenous people in our country and in Central and South America were pushed out of their ancestral homes and lands when Europeans came in. So this was a similar type of process. I feel it's very, very similar to what's happened on our continent.
Yes, Alison Weir, Alison, Weir, Weir, has written 2 very powerful books, and you can Google that information and read her books. Describes in her book, If Americans Knew, describes the uprooting of the Palestinians right after Israel was created as a nation. And it was especially after World War II, which ended in 1945, that Jewish people moved on into that area because the Zionists specifically wanted that area to be an Israel, for a homeland for Jews. Many Jews in this country did not particularly subscribe to that. They wanted to live there if they wanted to, but certainly live in other areas too. But Alison Weir describes the uprooting of the Palestinians from their land. It was long, it was bloody, there were many deaths. That was information Americans did not get.
What can we do, Ann and Linda Furr, to bring peace to that region for our children and grandchildren in the coming generations?
I believe in the democratic process. I do believe the solution could be just an election away in Israel. We just happen to have a very right-wing government that barely was in Israel now, that was able, under Netanyahu, that was only able to put a government together by joining with another group that it did not want to join with. It is even more right-wing than Netanyahu's group. They have a government formed now. I believe in the next election that might change.
Thank you, Linda. Ann?
I would encourage listeners to consider ways that they could support nonviolent oriented groups here in Chico or nationwide. Support the Chico Peace and Justice Center. Support the Chico Palestine Action Group, which I'll give you the website in a moment, because there are groups that are making some progress. There have been boycotts and there are divestment campaigns that are ongoing related to what Israel is doing. And there have been movements that have brought about change. We have a strong history of that in America because we're a democratic country, so we can speak out here. It's still not yet against the law to speak up and speak out, and this radio program is part of that. KZFR, listen to Democracy Now!, listen to Bill Mash's programs, and you'll hear points of view that are counter to the norm. But growing a movement is really important. If you don't have the time, putting in your money, helping support groups. There's Fellowship of Reconciliation. There's Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a strong Jewish organization that works for peace and justice in the Middle East. There's numerous ways. Our own website for the Chico Palestine Action Group, which you can contact for more information on what we're doing, because we'll have our petitions out there, which we plan to send in to officials across the country, from the federal officials to our folks that go to the state of California legislature assembly. And so we'll have petitions out. You'll want to find out more about that, I would imagine, and what you can do, because I do believe that Chicoans are a generous and community-oriented, altruistic group of people. We've gotten a lot of support in Chico for what we're trying to do. But just for those of you who are very conscious of online communication, it's www.chicopalestineaction, all one word. That's CHICOPALESTINE.org. That's how you can be in touch with us. And Linda and we're part of a very small group, but we're dynamic and we haven't given up yet, and we don't plan to anytime soon. So find out more about us this way.
Also, we have a Facebook page that has gets a fair amount of traffic, KZFR, Peace and Social Justice Show. And we'll have your information out there as well, so folks can find it easy, quote unquote, on Facebook. Linda Furr, do you have anything to end for our audience members? I want to hear one couple more words of wisdom from Linda Furr.
I do want to invite anybody who cares a lot and would like to join us when we boycott outside of Target. It's on East 20th Street. We're out there the first and third Sundays of the month. We may change it to the second and the fourth. We're not sure, because one of our regulars won't be able to go on the first and third anymore. But come and join us. We have wonderful signs. We've got one right here. What is it? Divest. We've got some of our signs here. Boycott Israeli products. It's a beautiful, colorful sign. Justice for Palestine. That's one of our signs. And then we have another one. Boycott Israeli products. That's the wonderful part about the BSD or BDS. The BDS. It is a peaceful way of touching Israel and tweaking at their conscience. It is peaceful, and we like that.
I just wanted to comment one last thing. The mission of the Chico Peace and Justice Center, with which we're closely affiliated, is the stated mission is justice through peace and peace through justice. And we recognize that you don't get peace until you have justice for everybody, and everybody feels that they matter equally. They have an equal shot at justice.
Once again, I just want to thank you both for coming and being on the Peace and Social Justice Show, January 22nd. Linda Furr, Ann Polivka.
Thank you
Palestine
for
Action
allowing
Group.
us.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for letting us come.